Okay, hi everyone. So, Christmas is coming up, and on that note, it only seems fitting that we have a Litsoc dedicated to Charles Dickens, the man behind the best known Christmas story outside of the Bible, A Christmas Carol. Some of this talk is going to be about that particular story, but it's also going to be about his body of work as a whole, because in many ways, A Christmas Carol fits the classic Dickens template. Dickens is an author who's created some of the best known stories, the best loved and indeed hated characters, and his legacy as one of our greatest novelists is assured. Today, I hope to demonstrate to you precisely why he deserves such a lofty status for all of his flaws. Now, before we get into the heart of the talk, I thought we'd start with a bit of Dickens trivia. So, first of all, the phrase "what the Dickens" originates from before Dickens's time, and it was used by the one English writer who is even better known than our man Charles, and that, of course, is William Shakespeare. It appears in Shakespeare's play The Merry Wives of Windsor, and it is believed that Shakespeare used it as a euphemism for the devil. The line from that play is, "I cannot tell what the Dickens' name is." Second bit of trivia, Dickens was involved in a train crash in France in 1865. His carriage dangled off a bridge, and apparently he remained calm and offered brandy to his fellow passengers before working to help free trapped passengers in the carriages below. And the last bit of trivia is that in Chatham, in Kent, where he spent much of his youth and the last 10 years of his life, there used to be an attraction called Charles Dickens World, which was a theme park complete with attractions such as a replica Victorian schoolhouse and a Great Expectations boat ride. Sadly, it closed and it's no longer there. Okay, so a bit about Charles Dickens the man. What's his story? So the life of Dickens very much informs his work. He was born in Portsmouth in 1812, and his comfortable middle-class upbringing was shattered when his father was imprisoned for debt, and Charles was taken out of school to work in a factory. He eventually returned to school, but his mother's resistance to this, because she wanted him to stay at work rather, once his father was released from prison, put a strain on their relationships. Before becoming a writer, Dickens worked mostly in law. He then became a journalist, which started his writing career, primarily through the Sketches by Boz short stories. Now, in terms of his personal life, he had been spurned by a lady called Maria Beadnell in his younger days because of, quote, unsatisfactory prospects, and he eventually married someone called Catherine Hogarth. Now, theirs was not a happy marriage, I'm afraid, and it turned out Dickens was caught red-handed having an affair with an actress by the name of Nellie Ternan, who was 27 years his junior. Very scandalous, and a bit reminiscent of his namesake, his kingly namesake, Charles II, actually, because he also had his own notorious relationships with an actress who went by the name of Nell. So why am I telling you all this about Charles Dickens' own life? It's because these experiences informed his own works, most obviously David Copperfield, whose titular hero has experiences and meets characters very similar to those in Dickens' life. Now, had Dickens himself not gone to work in a bootblacking factory, leaving behind his comfortable middle-class life, it could be argued that he may not have developed an empathy for the poor, which is most famously depicted arguably in the workhouse of Oliver Twist. And also, without his background in the law, he might not have been in a position to dissect the Court of Chancery as he does in Bleak House. And lastly, his fractious relationship with his mother might explain his difficulty in understanding women, both in his life and in his novels. So Dickens is the author of some 20 novels, if we include the Christmas novellas. Now, this is a presentation. I can't really go into the novels in depth. So what I'm going to do, in the spirit of our Twitter social media age, I've attempted to summarise each of the non-Christmas books for you in 140 characters or less across the next 3 slides, starting with this one. So these are the 5 early ones, or the 5 first ones. And clearly, as I've already alluded to it, the most famous of his early stories, apart from A Christmas Carol, is Oliver Twist. So for those of you whose knowledge of the story primarily comes through the musical Oliver, I would advise you to read the book, or at least seek out a grittier film adaptation, because the musical is a significant softening of what is at times a very hard-edged tale. So this is from the middle period, Now, most people see Dombey and Son as the book where he transitioned from the earlier sort of picaresque style of novel to a more mature and sophisticated style with more complex plots and characters. And they also start to have a kind of more epic scope and range as well during this time. Bleak House is one notable example because it takes in a huge array of characters, settings, and narrative voices. As you can see, we also have David Copperfield here too, which perhaps unsurprisingly was Dickens' own personal favourite of his novels. My own personal favourite of Dickens' novels comes from his later works, and to me that is in the form of Great Expectations. Here we have hallmarks such as humour and satire very much in evidence, but it's noticeable that the later novels are considerably darker in tone and mood, with more subdued happy endings, kind of mirroring his own personal unhappiness. Now, Jean Rhys, author of Wide Sargasso Sea, is one author who has gone on record as saying that you can only write if you're unhappy. And it can be argued that Dickens produced his best work when he was unhappy. Now, there's a cheerful thought for you. All right, so what were the main themes and motifs of Dickens' work? One critic claimed that the message of every one of his books can be boiled down to one simple thing: people should be nicer to each other. That critic is not wrong, but there is a lot more to Dickens' novels than that, and he does incorporate a wide variety of themes and motifs. One being social commentary and criticism. Now, he certainly didn't hold back in his criticism of certain institutions and social injustices. He would often weave his criticism into the action of the novel, but he famously once deviated from that to address to the reader and press upon them the issue of high rates of child mortality in Bleak House. So there's a character called Joe, a destitute crossing sweeper. Spoilers, he dies. And basically Dickens, when that happens, he just goes off on a bit of a tangent and says, "Yes, your grace, less your ladies and gentlemen, your majesty, dead and dying around us every day." As in, there's so much child poverty that there is so much children dying before their time. So, he's very much confrontational there. But he could be more subtle. He wasn't always just direct. One example being Hard Times, which criticised the then fashionable theory of utilitarianism via the facts-obsessed Mr. Gradgrind and the very much grim-up-north archetypal, but albeit fictional, settlement of Coketown, which has got a total disconnect from London life and preoccupations, which indeed is something many would argue still resonates today, the North-South divide. Okay, so Dickens is very masterful. There's no one better, really, at conjuring a very vivid sense of place as well. His descriptions of London are particularly famous, one being the opening of Bleak House, which vividly depicts the November gloom of London with some very beautiful prose. For example, smoke lowering down from chimney pots, making a soft black drizzle, with flakes of soot in it as big as full-grown snowflakes. Gone into mourning, one might imagine, for the death of the sun. Now, you get a real sense of the oppressive, despondent mood of this area of London with, very rich sentences like this. Now, it turns out that this area of London, where he's describing, is where the Court of Chancery is, and that's where he's aiming his weapons of social criticism toward. It's not just about the great canvas of the big external outdoor scenes. He does focus on the interior scenes as well, very effectively. One example being Jaggers, the lawyer's office in Great Expectations, where he lists the things that are in there, such as the old rusty pistol, the swords in scabbards, so a very weaponized room, dreadful casts on the shelves, and of course the high back chair with black horsehair and rows of brass nails like a coffin. So very potent adjectives and grim similes, which really serve to add a real menacing effect to the office, and by extension Jaggers himself. Although Jaggers is not necessarily as sinister a character as, say, Mr. Tulkinghorn from Bleak House, but nonetheless he does have a sort of bit of an edge to him. Now, one of Dickens' less appealing traits, at least for me, is his tendency to give in to pathos and sentimentality. He's got a real propensity for maudlin tear-jerking. Now, part of the reason that so many of the recent TV adaptations of Dickens work so well, so things like Little Dorrit and Bleak House, is that they strip away the sentimentality. Dickens, unfortunately, in his books, he does layer it on quite thick, and it can be very difficult to digest. It's just awful, really. The Victorians are notorious for sentimental literature, And, he's a product of his time. He's as big a part of it as anyone. And he would sentimentalise children in particular. Now, on this slide, we have a picture of little Nell with her grandfather. And little Nell is the worst example of all in terms of sentimentality. Her depiction, particularly of, spoilers again, of her final moments of her death, just might make you throw up. Or at least laugh, anyway, unintentionally. So, yeah, pathos and sentimentality is, pervades Dickens novels, I'm afraid, and it's one of the less appealing things about him. But one of the best things about him are his very memorable, larger-than-life characters that have been enshrined in literary memory. So many of them have transcended the books they came from to gain immortality. Fagin, Mr. Micawber, and Uriah Heep are 3 examples. The more ridiculous characters are the primary source of humour, which we find in Dickens novels. And the more grotesque ones prove that the old saying that the devil has the best tunes is very much true, certainly in Dickens's works. So Little Nell, who we just talked about, she's a tedious bore, whilst the evil Quillip, eating cigars, is fascinating. We love him. Oliver Twist, simpering annoyance. Artful Dodger, the pickpocket, oodles of kudos. So the characters are often black and white, but in later novels, a few of them can be more complex as his work gets more sophisticated. So one example is Pip in Great Expectations. So he goes from being an innocent, corrupted, to quite unsympathetic, to eventually, ultimately, a repentant and tragic hero. Now, I did mention earlier about his mummy issues and his issues with women. Women are not portrayed especially well, I would say. They tend to fall in one of 2 camps. They're either passive goody two-shoes, innocents, or at least one of hideous, despicable, or just plain weird. So yeah, it does stem from his own inability to properly engage with women properly. And very often, the women in Dickens's novels are all about what they are in relation to the men. And that even counts when they're ostensibly the main character, such as Esther Summerson in Bleak House or Little Dorrit. They're essentially just kind of spokes on the greater narrative wheel, and I can only apologise for that. Sorry, everyone. All right, so let's get on to A Christmas Carol then, not before time. Its place as arguably the single most popular, well-known and adapted Christmas story, again, outside of the Bible, is very assured. I seriously doubt that anyone watching this will not have seen at least one adaptation. If you've not seen The Muppets Christmas Carol, then I just want to know what on earth you've been watching during the Yuletide season for all these years. If you haven't seen any of the adaptations, though, you probably are able to give a basic summary of the story. So I don't need to give a summary of the story here myself, I'm sure. So the question is, why is it so popular, and why is its legacy so assured? Well, it's largely because A Christmas Carol features all of the universally appealing classic Dickensian tropes that I've discussed before. So we've got social commentary and criticism, and this is most obviously depicted in the huge gaps in wealth between Scrooge and his clerk, Bob Cratchit. Scrooge hoards his wealth in a miserly manner, eating pea soup in his huge underheated house, whilst the impoverished Cratchits stretch their meagre resources to bring an approximation of Christmas cheer. Also, we can think of Scrooge's callous and very famous and very quotable dismissal of a request for a charitable donation. Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? Which is illustrative of a mean-spirited lack of empathy for the less fortunate that, I'm afraid to say, we can often still see in evidence today. Scene settings and description are very prominent too. We get some very vivid atmospheric descriptions that make the places themselves characters, or at least a reflection of the characters they're in. So, for example, you've got the warmth and expansive generosity of Fezziwig's party. Think of the school when Ghost of Christmas Past takes him to the school, because obviously he took him to Fezziwig's party, but before that to the school. Think of the cold and loneliness of the school that he's stranded in his youth. And then, of course, we've got the chilling misery of his own office as well. All of these are very evocative masterclasses in personification, personifying a place to match the character. Now, pathos and sentimentality, that's by the bucket load. I mean, Tiny Tim alone He takes a wrecking ball of sappiness to the narrative here. That's perhaps arguably not as vomit-inducing as Little Nell. But really, when it comes to the pathos and sentimentality, it's all about that feel-good ending, of course, which, of course, we're all on board with because, well, it's Christmas, isn't it? So that's why we're all on board with the sentimentality there. But ultimately, again, best of all, it's those characters, isn't it? That's why it's so memorable. Scrooge himself, I mean, he's become a byword for someone who doesn't like Christmas. How often do we just say, oh, he's a Scrooge, she's a Scrooge, if somebody doesn't like Christmas? And bar humbug is the ultimate Christmas Grumps catchphrase of choice. You can get, like, Christmas hats in black with bar humbug emblazoned across them. All that comes from Dickens too. Tiny Tim, we've already mentioned, so I'm not going to dwell on him too much. But then, think of the three spirits as well. The ghosts of Christmas past, present, future. You've probably got an image in your mind of what they look like. They're all vivid and memorable, distinctive and effective in what they do. And then we also have the other spirits who features in the story. Jacob Marley, famously wreathed in chains, and he makes one of the best entrances to a story in the history of literature, appearing as a face, or a ghostly face, on Scrooge's door knocker. So yeah, the characters are another huge reason why it's gone down in history as well. But what really gives A Christmas Carol the edge over all of his other stories, which of course a lot of them are very popular, remember in their own right, what elevates it above all of those to the status of Dickens' single best-loved work is the fact that the values that we associate with Christmas today, things such as an emphasis on family get-togethers and family time, showing goodwill to all people, having seasonal food and drink, and just generally having a good time and making merry, all have their roots in A Christmas Carol. In essence, it is largely because of Dickens that we celebrate Christmas in the way that we do today. It is the people should be nicer to each other message at its very best. Because what happens in The Christmas Carol, Scrooge's journey to redemption, it just sends the message that even the seemingly meanest and basest person in the whole world is able to change for the good, and that's a really powerful message of hope, a really good, powerful Christmas message. So, thanks to Dickens, we now associate Christmas with all that is good about humanity. And if nothing else, we should all be grateful for that. So thank you, everyone. All I can say is Merry Christmas. God bless us, everyone, in the words of Tiny Tim. And this isn't the last Litsoc. At least I don't think it is. Provisionally, it's not planned to be the last Litsoc of term. We're going to be talking about some more Christmas reads next week. But allow me to wish you all a very Merry Christmas anyway, and keep reading. Thank you. Bye.